George Strait carries a box of clothes for a humble family, and what he did next impacted everyone. The merciless Texas sun beat down on James Rodriguez's shoulders as he hefted another cardboard box from the sidewalk into the battered trunk of his friend's 1998 Chevy Impala. Sweat trickled down his temples, mingling with tears he refused to let fall. At 42 years old, James had never imagined he'd find himself in this position, homeless, jobless, and with 3 children and a wife depending on him. "Daddy, can I help?" 10-year-old Miguel tugged at his father's sleeve, his dark eyes wide with concern no child his age should have to bear. James forced a smile, ruffling his son's hair. "No, mijo, these are too heavy. Why don't you help your mother with Lucy's things?" The boy nodded solemnly and trudged back to where Maria sat on a plastic milk crate, cradling their youngest, 6-year-old Lucy. The little girl's breathing was labored, despite the emergency inhaler the paramedics had given her after the fire. Her small chest heaved with each breath, and James felt his heart constrict at the sound. The apartment fire had started in the unit below theirs. Faulty wiring, the fire marshal had said. By the time they'd awakened to the smoke alarm's piercing wail at 2:17 a.m., black smoke was already pouring through the vents. James had grabbed Lucy, while Maria shepherded Miguel and 14-year-old Elena through the smoke-filled hallway. They'd escaped with nothing but the clothes on their backs and whatever they could grab in the desperate rush to safety. If you've ever experienced sudden tragedy, you know how quickly life can change. Don't wait until disaster strikes. Ensure your family has an emergency plan today. What little they'd managed to salvage now sat in 5 cardboard boxes on the sidewalk. Photo albums, water damaged from the firefighters' hoses, a few items of clothing that had been in the laundry room across the complex, and Elena's school backpack. Their entire life reduced to 5 boxes and $78.52, all the money James had in his pocket when they fled. "We should get going, James," Maria called softly. "The shelter said they close registration at 6. She didn't mention that they might not get beds if they arrived too late. They both knew the reality of their situation. James nodded, lifting another box. His muscles screamed in protest, not just from the weight, but from the bone-deep exhaustion of having been awake for nearly 30 hours straight. The construction job he'd lost 3 weeks ago had been physically demanding, but this helplessness was crushing him in ways physical labor never could. "Need a hand there, friend?" The voice came from behind him deep and distinctly. Texan. James turned to find a man in his 60s standing a few feet away. The stranger wore a simple plaid button-up shirt, well-worn jeans, and scuffed cowboy boots. The wide brim of his cream-colored Stetson cast a shadow over his face, but James could make out kind eyes and smile lines etched deep by years in the sun. "I'm fine, sir, thank you," James replied automatically, his pride still intact despite everything. The stranger glanced at the meager pile of boxes, then at the family huddled on the sidewalk. "Doesn't look fine to me," he said, not unkindly. "It looks like you could use an extra pair of hands. I've got 2 good ones not doing anything particularly important right now." Before James could protest again, the man had already lifted one of the heavier boxes with surprising ease for someone his age. "Where to?" he asked simply. James hesitated, then relented. "The trunk, please. And thank you." As they worked, side by side loading the remaining boxes, the stranger introduced himself simply as George. "Passing through?" he asked, nodding toward the family and their possessions. James swallowed hard. "Had a fire last night? Lost everything except what you see here?" George nodded soberly. "I'm real sorry to hear that. Everyone get out okay?" "Yes, thank God," James said, glancing toward Lucy. "Though my youngest has asthma." The smoke didn't help. George followed his gaze to where Lucy sat, wheezing softly in her mother's arms. His expression changed subtly, a flicker of deeper concern crossing his weathered features. "Where y'all headed now?" James's shoulders sagged slightly. Municipal shelter on Commerce Street, at least until we figure something out. He didn't mention how they'd already called every relative within driving distance, only to hear the same refrain. We wish we could help, but... In the background, Elena had been watching the interaction closely. At 14, she was at that age where embarrassment was a constant companion, and their current circumstances mortified her. Now she was staring at the stranger with an odd expression, tugging insistently at her mother's sleeve. "You work construction?" George asked, noting James's calloused hands. "Did. Got laid off 3 weeks ago when I needed time off for Lucy's doctor appointments." James hadn't meant to share so much with a stranger, but something about the man's straightforward kindness broke through his reserve. 22 years of experience, never missed a day until my daughter got sick, and Peterson lets me go without a second thought. George's expression hardened momentarily. "Peterson Construction, over on Highland Boulevard." James nodded, surprised. "You know it?" "Know of it," George replied cryptically. "Known Chuck Peterson a long time." Maria approached then, holding Lucy, while Elena hovered behind her, eyes wide and fixed on George. "James, we should go," Maria said softly, her eyes darting nervously to the stranger. "This is George," James introduced. "He was kind enough to help with the boxes." Maria's smile was tentative, the strain of their situation evident in the dark circles under her eyes and the tight set of her mouth. "Thank you for your help." "Mama?" Eleanor whispered urgently in Spanish. "It's George Strait, the singer!" Maria hushed her daughter quickly, embarrassed. "Elena, don't be rude," she whispered back. George pretended not to hear, but a small smile played at the corners of his mouth. "We really appreciate your help, but we need to get going," James said, reaching for his wallet. "I don't have much, but please, let me—" "Put that away," George said firmly, holding up a hand. "I didn't help for money." James nodded, blinking rapidly to clear the sudden moisture in his eyes. "Well, thank you again," he said, extending his hand. George shook it firmly, then seemed to make a decision. "Where'd you say this shelter was?" "On Commerce." "About 15 minutes from here," James replied. George glanced at his watch, then at Lucy, whose breathing seemed to be growing more labored in the oppressive heat. "Mind if I make a quick call before you go? Might have a better option for y'all." Before James could respond, George had pulled out a cell phone and walked a few paces away. The family watched as he spoke animatedly to someone, gesturing occasionally in their direction. After a few minutes, he returned, a satisfied look on his face. "Got a proposition for you," he said to James. "Friend of mine has a guest house sitting. Empty, it's furnished, has air conditioning, and it's yours for at least 3 months, no charge. Time enough to get back on your feet." James stared at him, dumbfounded. We couldn't accept," he stammered. "Sure you could," George countered easily. "Place is just sitting there collecting dust. Be doing my friend a favor, having someone look after it." Maria stepped forward, Lucy still in her arms. "Why would you do this for strangers?" George looked at the little girl, then met Maria's gaze steadily. "Ma'am, I've been blessed in my life. Figure the good Lord didn't grant those blessings just so I could keep them to myself." Lucy had been watching George with curious eyes. Now she spoke up, her voice thin and wheezy. "Are you really George Strait, the singer my grandpa loves?" A moment of silence hung in the air before George chuckled, tipping his hat back slightly. "Well now, your grandpa has fine taste in music." Elena gasped audibly, while Maria's hand flew to her mouth. "I'm sorry," James said, confused. "I don't understand." Miguel tugged at his father's shirt. "Dad, George Strait is famous. Abuelo plays his songs all the time." James looked at the man with new eyes, gradually recognizing the face he'd seen on album covers in his father-in-law's prize collection. The king of country stood before them, having just loaded their salvaged possessions into a borrowed car as casually as any neighbor might. "Mr. Strait," James began, suddenly self-conscious. "We had no idea." George waved away his words. "Just George, please, and it doesn't change the offer. That guest house is sitting empty, and your family needs a place to stay. Simple as that." Lucy coughed violently then, a harsh barking sound that shook her tiny frame. Her lips were taking on a faintly bluish tinge. "She needs her medication," Maria said urgently. "The rescue inhaler isn't working well enough." "Hospital's 10 minutes away," George said decisively. "My truck's right over there. Let's go." "What about our things?" James asked, gesturing helplessly at the car. "I'll have someone pick it up and bring everything to the guest house," George replied, already guiding them toward a gleaming black pickup truck parked across the street. "Right now, your daughter needs help." As they hurried toward the truck, with George carrying Lucy effortlessly in his strong arms, James felt a dizzying mix of emotions: fear for his daughter, disbelief at their situation, and a fragile, tentative hope he hadn't dared feel in weeks. In the space of 20 minutes, they'd gone from loading their meager possessions for a trip to a homeless shelter to riding in George Strait's personal truck, headed for the hospital. James caught Maria's eye as they settled Lucy between them in the back seat, George and Elena in the front. "It'll be okay," Maria whispered, squeezing his hand. For the first time since the fire alarm had jolted them from sleep, James almost believed it might be true. 3 hours later, Lucy slept peacefully in a private hospital room, her breathing finally eased by proper medication and the cool, filtered air. James stood at the window, watching darkness fall over San Antonio, his mind still struggling to process the day's events. "Coffee?" George's voice came from the doorway. He held out a steaming cup. "Thank you," James said, accepting it gratefully. "Not just for this, for everything. I don't know how we can ever repay you." George leaned against the wall beside him, sipping his own coffee. "Not looking to be repaid. Besides, this is just the beginning." James looked at him questioningly. "Doctor says Lucy needs consistent medication, follow-up appointments, possibly some specialists," George explained. "Can't do that without insurance or steady income." James's momentary relief crumbled as reality crashed back. "I've been applying everywhere. Nobody's hiring in construction right now, not with the experience I have. They say I'm overqualified for entry-level and underqualified for management." "Tell me about what happened with Peterson Construction," George said, his tone casual but his eyes sharp with interest. James sighed heavily, staring into his coffee. The memory still stung, sharp and humiliating. "I've worked construction since I was 18. Started as a laborer, worked my way up to foreman. Was with Peterson for the last 6 years. He took a sip of coffee before continuing. "When Lucy was diagnosed with severe asthma last month, she needed tests, specialist appointments. I asked Chuck Peterson for some flexibility with my schedule, not time off, just coming in an hour late sometimes, making it up in the evening." "And he refused?" George prompted when James fell silent. "Worse, he agreed at first. Then when I missed a meeting because Lucy had an emergency, couldn't breathe in the middle of the night, had to rush her to the ER. He called me unreliable, said I had family issues that were interfering with my work." James's voice tightened. "Next day, he let me go, said they were restructuring. He gave me 2 weeks severance for 6 years of breaking my back for his company." George's expression darkened. "That doesn't sound like the Christian values Chuck's always preaching about at the Chamber of Commerce meetings." "The worst part? He hired my assistant Pablo to replace me at half my salary. Kid's good, but he's got 3 years' experience to my 22. James shook his head bitterly. "It wasn't about restructuring. It was about saving money at my family's expense." The door to Lucy's room opened, and Maria entered with Elena and Miguel, carrying sandwiches from the cafeteria. "She's still sleeping," Maria reported softly, handing James a wrapped sandwich. "Doctor says we can take her home tomorrow morning if her oxygen levels stay stable." The word home hung awkwardly in the air. "About that," George said, "I've got my assistant bringing the keys to the guest house. It's on a ranch about 20 minutes outside the city. Quiet, clean air, good for Lucy's lungs." Eleanor, who had been unusually quiet, finally spoke up. "Why are you doing all this, Mr. Strait? You don't even know us." George considered the teenager thoughtfully. "When I was about your brother's age," he nodded toward Miguel, "my family lost our home in a fire too." 5 pairs of eyes fixed on him in surprise. It was just a small house in Pearsall, nothing fancy, but it was everything to us. George's gaze turned distant with memory. "Neighbor family took us in for a while. Didn't have much themselves, but they shared what they had." He refocused on Elena. "Never forgot that kindness. Promised myself if I ever had the means, I'd pass it on." "Did you always want to be a singer?" Miguel asked, his earlier shyness forgotten. George smiled. "Not always. Was heading toward a teaching career for a while. Then joined the army. Formed a band called Rambling Country while stationed in Hawaii, if you can believe that." Hawaii!" Miguel's eyes widened. "I thought you were Texas forever." "Texas born and Texas returned," George confirmed. "But life takes some unexpected turns sometimes." James felt those words resonate deep in his chest. Just 24 hours ago, he had been lying awake, worrying about how to make their dwindling funds last, until he found work. Now they were sitting in a private hospital room, being offered housing by one of country music's biggest legends. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. A woman in her 40s with an efficient manner stepped in, nodding respectfully to George. "Mr. Strait, I've brought the keys and some essentials for the family," she said, holding up a ring of keys and a large paper bag. "Thank you, Denise," George replied. "This is James Rodriguez and his family." "James, this is Denise, my personal assistant. She's included her contact information if you need anything." Denise handed James a folder along with the keys. "Inside, you'll find directions to the property, the security code, and my business card. I've stocked the refrigerator with basics: milk, eggs, bread, some fruit. There are clean linens on the beds and toiletries in the bathrooms." James accepted the items, speechless at the thoroughness of their preparation. "I also retrieved your belongings from your friend's car," Denise continued. "Everything has been transported to the guest house." How did you find the car?" Maria asked in amazement. Denise smiled slightly. "Mr. Strait provided the license plate number and location. I simply arranged for secure transportation." After Denise left, James turned to George. "I don't know what to say." "You don't need to say anything," George replied simply. "But there is something I want to talk to you about once Lucy's settled at the guest house tomorrow." Before James could question him further, the door opened again, this time admitting Dr. Patel, Lucy's attending physician. "Mr. and Mrs. Rodriguez," she greeted them, then nodded respectfully to George. "Mr. Strait." She checked Lucy's vitals, making notes on her tablet. "Her oxygen levels are much improved. The combination of medications is working well." She turned to James and Maria. "I've spoken with the hospital administration. Lucy has been approved for the Children's Health Assistance Program. It will cover her medications and follow-up visits for the next 6 months." Maria gasped. "But we haven't even applied." Dr. Patel glanced briefly at George. "The application has been expedited. These things can happen when caring community members get involved." After the doctor left, James looked at George with dawning understanding. "Did you," George shrugged, "made a donation to their pediatric wing a few years back." They were kind enough to push through some paperwork. That night, after George had gone home with a promise to check on them the next day, James and Maria sat together beside Lucy's hospital bed, whispering so as not to wake Elena and Miguel, who were asleep on a pull-out couch in the corner. "I can't believe this is happening," Maria said softly, still stunned by the day's events. James squeezed her hand. "I know, it feels like a dream. Or a miracle," Maria suggested, her faith never wavering despite their hardships. "George Strait," James marveled, shaking his head. "My father would never believe it. Remember how he used to play Amarillo by morning on his old guitar?" Maria smiled at the memory. "He said it was the perfect song, simple but profound, just like life should be." They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching Lucy's chest rise and fall in peaceful sleep. "What do you think he wants to talk to you about tomorrow?" Maria finally asked. James shook his head. "I don't know, but whatever it is, I trust him." He looked at his sleeping daughter, then at his wife's exhausted face. "We've lost almost everything, but somehow I feel like we've been given a second chance." "We have each other," Maria reminded him, leaning her head on his shoulder. "That's what your father always said was the true measure of wealth." James nodded, throat tight with emotion. Outside the hospital window, the San Antonio night sparkled with city lights, and for the first time in weeks, the future didn't seem quite so dark. The next morning, a hospital volunteer arrived with 4 shopping bags. "New clothes for everyone," she announced cheerfully. "Anonymous donation." Inside were jeans, shirts, underwear, and shoes in exactly the right sizes for each family member. James met Maria's eyes, and they shared a look of stunned gratitude. They both knew who their anonymous benefactor was. By noon, Lucy was discharged with a month's supply of medication and clear instructions for her care. As promised, George arrived to drive them to the guest house, this time in a spacious SUV that easily accommodated the family and their meager possessions. As they drove away from San Antonio proper, the urban landscape gradually gave way to rolling hills and sprawling ranches. James watched his children's faces brighten as they passed horses grazing in green pastures and longhorn cattle lazily chewing beneath oak trees. "Your place is beautiful," Maria commented as they turned onto a private road lined with mesquite trees. "Thank you," George replied. "Been here since the mid-80s. Raised my son here with my wife Norma. Good place for a family." After several minutes down the winding road, they crested a hill, and a large Spanish-style ranch house came into view, surrounded by manicured grounds. But George drove past the main house, following a smaller path that led to a charming limestone cottage nestled among live oak trees. "Here we are," he announced, parking in front of the guest house. "Home sweet home, at least for now." The family climbed out, staring in wonder at the picturesque cottage. It was easily 3 times the size of their apartment, with a wide porch wrapping around the front, complete with rocking chairs and hanging plants. "This is the guest house?" Eleanor whispered. In disbelief, George smiled at her reaction. "It's nothing fancy, but it's comfortable." Inside, the cottage was a revelation. Spacious rooms with hardwood floors, comfortable furniture, and large windows that filled the space with natural light. A fully equipped kitchen opened onto a dining area and living room. Down a hallway, they found 3 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms. "Master bedroom's through there," George pointed. Thought Lucy might do better in the room with its own bathroom. Less distance to travel at night if she's having trouble. James watched as his children explored the house in awe. Miguel had already discovered a deck out back that overlooked a small pond. Elena was running her fingers over a bookshelf filled with novels and reference books. Lucy, still tired from her hospital stay but already looking better, held tightly to Maria's hand as they investigated the kitchen. George, James began, his voice thick with emotion, I don't know how to thank you. Like I said, no thanks needed. George gestured for James to follow him outside. They walked a short distance from the house, stopping under the shade of a massive oak tree. James, I meant what I said about wanting to talk to you, George said, his expression serious now. I've been thinking about your situation with Peterson Construction. James tensed slightly. The humiliation of his firing was still raw. I've known Chuck Peterson for 20 years, George continued. We've served on charity boards together, played golf, shared more than a few whiskeys. He paused. What he did to you doesn't sit right with me. It's business, James said flatly, though the words tasted bitter. That's what he told me. No, it's not just business, it's wrong. George's voice had an edge to it now. Using a man's sick child as an excuse to cut costs? That's not the Texas way I was raised with. James looked away, uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. I appreciate your concern, but I need to focus on finding a new job, not dwelling on the past. That's exactly what I want to talk to you about, George said. I have connections with Hernandez Development Group. Santiago Hernandez is a good friend and a fair man. He's looking for an experienced project manager for a new development breaking ground next month. James stared at him, hope and wariness battling in his expression. I couldn't ask you to— You didn't ask, I'm offering, George interrupted gently. All I do is make an introduction. The rest would be up to you. But James, he added, his gaze intensifying, there's something else we need to address. What's that? Chuck Peterson needs to be held accountable, not just for your sake, but for others like you who might face the same treatment. James felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. What are you suggesting? I'm on the board of the Business Ethics Council of Texas, George explained. We investigate complaints about unfair labor practices. If you'd be willing to file a formal complaint, I believe it could make a difference. I can't afford a legal battle, James protested, and I need references for future work. If I file a complaint, the council provides legal assistance pro bono for cases they take on, George assured him. And as for references, I think Santiago Hernandez would be more interested in your 2 decades of experience than in Chuck Peterson's opinion. James fell silent, considering the proposition. The thought of confronting his former employer was intimidating, but the memory of being dismissed so callously after years of loyal service burned in his chest. I need to discuss this with Maria, he finally said. George nodded respectfully. Of course. Family decisions should be made as a family. He glanced back toward the guest house where Maria stood on the porch watching them. But James, remember this. Sometimes standing up isn't just about getting justice for yourself. It's about making sure others don't have to suffer the same injustice. As they walked back to the house, James felt the weight of the decision before him. He had always been a man who kept his head down, did his work, and avoided confrontation. But now, with his family's future hanging in the balance and an unexpected ally in his corner, he wondered if it was time to take a stand. What he didn't know was that the decision he was about to make would set in motion events that would not only change his family's future, but would send ripples through the entire San Antonio business community, and that George Strait's involvement in their lives was about to go far deeper than any of them could have imagined. Act 3. The Revelation. The guest house quickly became more than just a temporary shelter for the Rodriguez family. It became a haven of healing. Lucy's breathing improved dramatically in the clean country air, away from the city pollutants that had aggravated her condition. Elena found peace in the quiet surroundings, often sitting on the back deck with a book from the well-stocked shelves. Miguel, initially withdrawn after the trauma of the fire, blossomed under the freedom to explore the ranch's safer areas, always under the watchful eye of Hank, one of George's ranch hands who'd taken a shine to the curious boy. 2 weeks after moving into the guest house, James sat at the kitchen table with papers spread before him. His interview with Santiago Hernandez had gone extraordinarily well, almost too well. The job offer that followed included a salary 20% higher than what Peterson had paid him, along with health benefits that would cover Lucy's medical needs beyond the temporary assistance program. "Are you still worrying?" Maria asked, placing a cup of coffee beside him. The afternoon sun streamed through the kitchen windows, highlighting the new threads of silver in her dark hair, stress markers from their recent hardships. "Not worrying," James corrected, looking up at his wife with a half smile. "Just trying to make sense of everything. It's happening so fast." Maria pulled out a chair and sat beside him, her fingers intertwining with his. "Good things can happen fast too, James. Not just disasters." He squeezed her hand. "I know. It's just hard to trust it." The complaint documents for the Business Ethics Council lay before him, filled out but unsigned. George had delivered them personally the previous day, along with news that 3 other former Peterson construction employees had come forward with similar stories after quietly hearing about James's situation. "You're still unsure about filing the complaint?" Maria asked gently. James nodded. "Peterson has connections all over this city. What if this backfires? We've already lost everything once." "Not everything," Maria corrected him firmly. "We still had each other, and now we have so much more thanks to George's kindness." The sound of tires on gravel interrupted their conversation. Through the window, they saw George's black pickup coming up the drive, with another vehicle, a sleek silver Mercedes, following behind. "Were we expecting anyone?" Maria asked, standing quickly to check her appearance in the small mirror by the door. James shook his head, equally puzzled. They watched as George parked and emerged from his truck, followed by a tall, elegantly dressed Hispanic man exiting the Mercedes. "Santiago Hernandez," James realized aloud, recognizing his prospective employer from their interview. "Why would he come here?" The knock on the door came moments later. James opened it to find George and Santiago standing on the porch, both men looking unusually serious. "James," George greeted him. "Hope we're not interrupting. Santiago needed to speak with you, and I thought it might be more comfortable here than at his office." James invited them in, making introductions to Maria as they settled in the living room. Lucy was napping, while Eleanor had taken Miguel down to the pond to look for frogs. "Mr. Rodriguez," Santiago began formally, "I want to be completely transparent about something that has come to my attention since our interview." James felt his stomach tighten. Here it comes, he thought. The offer rescinded, the dream shattered. "I received a call from Chuck Peterson yesterday," Santiago continued, confirming James's fears. "He had heard you were interviewing with my company and took it upon himself to contact me." Maria's hand found James's, squeezing tightly. "He strongly advised against hiring you," Santiago said bluntly, "claimed you were unreliable, frequently absent, and had left projects unfinished." James felt heat rising in his face, anger and humiliation warring for dominance. "That's not true. I never—" Santiago held up a hand, stopping James's protest. "I know it's not true, Mr. Rodriguez. That's why I'm here." James blinked in confusion. "When I receive such a call about a candidate I'm considering, especially one with 22 years of experience and exemplary references from everyone except his most recent employer, I become curious." Santiago's expression hardened slightly. "I've been in business in San Antonio for 30 years. I know when someone is attempting to blackball a good worker for personal reasons." George, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. "Santiago and I have been friends a long time. When he told me about Chuck's call, I shared what you told me about your situation. Hope you don't mind." James shook his head numbly. What happened to you is not just unfortunate, it's potentially illegal, Santiago continued. Texas may be an at-will employment state, but there are still protections against discrimination based on family medical issues. That's what the Ethics Council representative said when I spoke to her, George added. Santiago leaned forward, his expression serious. Here's what concerns me, James. If Chuck Peterson is willing to fire a dedicated employee for needing flexibility, to care for a sick child, and then actively work to prevent that employee from finding new employment, what else might he be doing that crosses ethical or legal lines? There have been rumors, George said quietly, about safety violations, undocumented workers paid below minimum wage, kickbacks from suppliers. James's eyes widened. He'd heard whispers among the crews but had dismissed them as job site gossip. I need to know if you observed anything during your time there that would substantiate these concerns, Santiago said carefully. Anything at all that seemed irregular or unsafe. James looked at Maria, who nodded encouragingly. Taking a deep breath, he began to speak. About 8 months ago, Peterson underbid a major downtown office project. The margins were already razor-thin. 2 months in, he started cutting corners, cheaper materials substituted after inspections, safety equipment borrowed from other sites and never returned. James paused. I protested, documented everything, started insisting on email approvals for changes rather than verbal instructions. That's when the troubles started, George guessed. James nodded. He accused me of not being a team player, said I was making trouble by creating unnecessary paper trails. Do you still have these emails? Santiago asked, a new intensity in his voice. Yes, James confirmed. I keep records of all project communications. It saved me more than once when disputes arose with suppliers or subcontractors. Those records could be extremely valuable, Santiago said, exchanging a meaningful look with George. For the Ethics Council complaint? James asked. Potentially for something much larger, Santiago replied. The State Contractors Board has had Peterson under scrutiny for some time, but they've lacked substantive evidence from inside the company. George leaned forward. James, what happened to your family is terrible. But if what Santiago and I suspect is true, Peterson's practices are putting workers' lives at risk and defrauding clients, including state and municipal governments. The implications slowly dawned on James. You're not just talking about my wrongful termination case anymore. No, Santiago confirmed. We're talking about potential criminal charges, and you may be the key witness. The weight of this revelation settled over the room. Maria's grip on James's hand tightened. What would this mean for us? She asked quietly. For our family? It was George who answered, his voice gentle but firm. It would mean challenges ahead, possible depositions perhaps, even court testimony if it goes that far. He paused. But it would also mean standing up for what's right, not just for yourselves, but for everyone Peterson has harmed, and everyone he might harm in the future. James felt a strange calm settling over him. All his adult life he'd worked with, his hands building things meant to last. He'd taken pride in doing honest work, in never cutting corners, even when it would have been easier. The thought that his former employer had not only discarded him unfairly, but was potentially endangering others, filled him with a quiet resolve. I'll need to think about this, he said finally. Discuss it with Maria privately. Of course, Santiago agreed, standing. Take whatever time you need. The position at Hernandez Development remains yours, regardless of what you decide about Peterson. Your qualifications and experience speak for themselves. As the men prepared to leave, George hung back briefly. One more thing, he said. Reaching into his pocket, he withdrew an envelope and handed it to James. Tickets to my benefit concert at the AT&T Center next Saturday. Thought your family might enjoy a night out. James stared at the envelope in surprise. That's very kind, but no buts, George interrupted with a smile. Good seats, too. You can meet some friends of mine backstage after the show. He tipped his hat to Maria. Norma and I would love to introduce you to some folks. After they'd gone, James and Maria stood together on the porch, watching the vehicles disappear down the winding drive. What do you think? James asked softly. Maria was quiet for a long moment before responding. I think that sometimes, mi amor, God puts us in difficult situations not to punish us, but to use us for a greater purpose. This could get complicated. He warned, if Peterson discovers I'm sharing information, we've already lost our home and most of our possessions, Maria pointed out pragmatically. What else can he take from us? James looked at the complaint forms still sitting on the kitchen table. If we do this, it's not just about getting justice for our family anymore. It never was, Maria replied simply. From the moment George stopped to help us with those boxes, this has been about something bigger than just us. The decision crystallized in James's mind. With a newfound sense of purpose, he returned to the table, picked up a pen, and signed the complaint forms with a steady hand. The AT&T Center hummed with the energy of 20,000 country music fans as the Rodriguez family was escorted to their seats. Not just good seats, as George had modestly suggested, but front-row center spots that had Eleanor practically vibrating with excitement. I can't believe we're here, she whispered to her father for the 10th time that evening. Alicia is going to die when I tell her. James smiled at his daughter's enthusiasm. The past week had been a whirlwind of activity. He'd started his new position at Hernandez Development, submitted his formal complaint and evidence to the Ethics Council, and given a preliminary statement to an investigator from the State Contractors Board. Through it all, George had checked in regularly, offering encouragement and practical support without ever making James feel like a charity case. The lights dimmed and the crowd roared as George's band took the stage, followed by the man himself. Dressed in his signature starched shirt, jeans and cowboy hat, he looked exactly as he had the day he'd stopped to help them on the street, unassuming despite his legendary status. How y'all doing tonight, San Antonio? George called out, earning another deafening cheer from the audience. As he launched into Amarillo by Morning, James felt a lump form in his throat, his father's favorite song now being performed live. Before them, by the man who had changed their family's trajectory so profoundly. Lucy, still thin but with healthier color in her cheeks, swayed gently in Maria's lap to the music. Miguel watched in wide-eyed wonder as George moved across the stage, acknowledging fans with nods and smiles. And Elena, usually so concerned, with appearing mature and sophisticated, abandoned all pretense of coolness as she sang along to every word. Midway through the concert, after a rousing rendition of All My Exes Live in Texas, George paused to address the crowd. You know, folks, I've been blessed beyond measure in my life, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the venue. Got to make music I love for people who somehow never get tired of hearing it. The crowd laughed appreciatively. But the greatest blessing isn't the gold records or the awards. It's the chance to make a difference in someone else's life when they need it most. James felt a prickle of awareness as George's gaze seemed to settle briefly on their family before continuing. There's a lot of talk these days about what's wrong with our country, with our communities. But I'm here to tell you that the heart of America, the heart of Texas, is still good people helping other good people through tough times. The audience applauded enthusiastically. I wrote this next song thinking about how life can change in an instant, how sometimes the hardest challenges bring the greatest opportunities for growth and connection. George nodded to his band, who began the soft introduction to I Saw God Today, By the time the concert ended, Lucy had fallen asleep in Maria's arms, a peaceful smile on her face despite the noise. As the crowd began to disperse, a security guard approached their row. "Mr. Rodriguez, I'm here to escort you and your family backstage." They followed him through a series of corridors until they reached a large room filled with people mingling around a catered buffet. George spotted them immediately, breaking away from a conversation to greet them warmly. "Glad you could make it," he said, shaking James's hand and giving Maria a gentle hug, careful not to disturb the sleeping Lucy. "Come on. There are some folks I want you to meet." He led them through the crowd to where a small group was engaged in conversation. James recognized Santiago Hernandez among them, along with a distinguished older man in a perfectly tailored suit. "James, Maria, I believe you know Santiago already," George said. "And this is Judge Robert Garza of the Texas Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. Bob, these are the folks I was telling you about." Judge Garza extended his hand to James. "Mr. Rodriguez, it's a pleasure. George has shared some of your story with me." James shook the judge's hand, suddenly understanding why George had been so intent on them attending tonight. This wasn't just a concert invitation. It was an introduction to people with the power to help their cause. "And this," George continued, gesturing to a sharp-eyed woman in a navy pantsuit, "is Rebecca Torres, investigative reporter for the San Antonio Express-News. Ms. Torres has been looking into construction industry practices for quite some time," Judge Garza explained, "particularly as they relate to government contracts." Rebecca's handshake was firm and confident. "Mr. Rodriguez, I understand you have quite a story to tell." Before James could respond, the backstage door burst open and a security guard hurried in, looking agitated. He whispered urgently into George's ear. George's expression darkened. "Are you certain?" The guard nodded grimly. George turned to James and Maria. "I'm sorry, but we need to move you folks immediately. Chuck Peterson is in the building, and he's demanding to speak to you. Says he knows you're here." Maria clutched Lucy closer. "How would he know that?" "Someone must have seen you in the front row," Santiago suggested. "Posted a photo online, perhaps." "He's intoxicated and becoming belligerent," the security guard added. "Police have been called." Judge Garza stepped forward. "I believe my private exit might be useful in this situation. George?" George nodded gratefully. "James, Maria, grab the kids. We need to go now." As they hurried through a service corridor, James could hear raised voices behind them. Lucy woke, frightened by the sudden movement and tension. "What's happening, Daddy?" she asked, her voice small and fearful. "Everything's fine, Mia," James assured her, though his heart was racing. "We're just taking a special way out." They emerged into a private parking area where several luxury vehicles waited. Judge Garza directed them to his car, a sleek black SUV with tinted windows. "My driver will take you directly home," he said. "George and I will handle the situation here." As they settled into the vehicle, James caught a glimpse of Chuck Peterson, being restrained by security guards near another exit, his face contorted with rage. "He's found us," Maria whispered, fear evident in her voice. James took her hand firmly in his. "No, querida. He found out where we were tonight, but he doesn't know where we're staying. We're safe." As the SUV pulled away, James looked back to see George and Judge Garza watching them go, a protective determination in their stances. In that moment, James realized that their family had gained not just temporary housing and employment, but powerful allies who were invested in seeing justice done. The driver navigated smoothly through San Antonio's Saturday night traffic, maintaining a vigilant awareness of their surroundings. No one followed them. By the time they reached the ranch, Lucy had fallen back asleep, and Miguel was struggling to keep his eyes open. Only Elena remained fully alert, her earlier excitement replaced by a new seriousness. "Dad," she said quietly, as they approached the guest house, "Peterson wouldn't really try to hurt us, would he, because of the complaint?" James considered his answer carefully. He'd always been honest with his children, believing that truth presented appropriately was better than false reassurance. "I don't think he would physically harm us," he said finally. "But he's angry and desperate. People in that state sometimes make poor decisions." Elena nodded thoughtfully. "That's why George and the judge helped us leave that way." "Yes," James confirmed. "They were being cautious, protecting us, like you always protect us," Elena said with unexpected maturity. "And now others are protecting our family too." James felt a surge of emotion at his daughter's insight. "That's right, Mija. We're not alone in this anymore." As they carried their sleeping younger children into the guest house, James's phone buzzed with a text message from George. "All clear. Peterson in custody for public intoxication and making threats. We'll call tomorrow. Rest easy." James showed the message to Maria, who visibly relaxed. "Thank God," she murmured. After tucking the children into their beds, James and Maria sat together on the porch swing, the night air cool and fragrant with mesquite and wildflowers. The stars spread across the Texas sky in a dazzling display impossible to see from their former apartment in the city. "I never expected any of this," James said quietly. "When the fire happened, I thought we'd hit rock bottom. I couldn't see any way forward." Maria leaned her head against his shoulder. "And now I understand what my father meant when he used to say, 'Sometimes you have to lose your way to find your purpose.'" "And what is our purpose in all this, do you think?" Maria asked. James considered the question, watching the distant lights of the main ranch house twinkling through the trees. "Maybe it's to show that one person standing up for what's right can make a difference, even against powerful people who think they're untouchable. With a little help from George Strait," Maria added with a small smile. "With a lot of help," James corrected. "But you know what amazes me most about him? He could have just written a check, made a donation, done the minimum. Instead, he got personally involved. He's risking his reputation, using his connections, putting himself out there, all for a family he met by chance on a street corner." "That's what makes him truly wealthy," Maria said softly. "Not his success or his ranch or his fame, but his willingness to see the humanity in others and respond with compassion." No. As they sat together under the stars, James felt a deep certainty that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them with newfound strength, and with allies they never could have imagined just a few weeks ago. The fire that had destroyed their home had also, paradoxically, opened a door to possibilities they never would have discovered otherwise. Tomorrow would bring new developments in their case against Peterson Construction. There would be statements to give, evidence to review, perhaps even threats to face. But tonight, in this peaceful moment with his wife beside him and his children, sleeping safely nearby, James Rodriguez felt something he hadn't experienced in a very long time. Hope, pure and undiminished by fear. And all because a country music legend had stopped to help carry a box. The Rodriguez family awoke Sunday morning to the sound of hoofbeats approaching the guest house. Elena was the first to the window, where she spotted George riding toward them on a magnificent Palomino quarter horse, leading a smaller paint pony behind him. "Mom! Dad! George is coming on horseback!" she called, her earlier fear from the concert incident forgotten in the excitement of this new development. Miguel rushed to join his sister at the window, his eyes widening at the sight. "And he's brought another horse." By the time James stepped onto the porch, George was dismounting with the easy grace of a man who'd spent a lifetime in the saddle. He tipped his hat in greeting. "Morning, James. Hope it's not too early for visitors." "Not at all," James assured him, taking in the beautiful animals. These are magnificent horses. George patted the Palomino's neck affectionately. This is Bandit, been my riding companion for 7 years now. He gestured to the paint pony. And this little lady is Pepper, gentlest horse on the ranch, perfect for beginners. Miguel and Elena had ventured out onto the porch, trying and failing to contain their excitement. Lucy appeared in the doorway beside Maria, still in her pajamas, but wide-eyed at the sight of the horses. Thought the kids might enjoy a morning ride, George explained. If that's all right with you and Maria. James looked to his wife, who nodded with a smile. That would be wonderful, she said. They've never had the chance to ride before. Well then, George replied, no time like the present. I've brought Pepper for the younger ones to take turns. Elena, if you're comfortable with it, my granddaughter's horse Daisy is saddled and waiting by the barn. She's a bit more spirited than Pepper, but still well-mannered for a newer rider. For the next 2 hours, the children received an impromptu riding lesson from a country music legend. George was a patient teacher, explaining everything from how to approach a horse safely to the basics of guiding with reins and leg pressure. Lucy, despite her health challenges, proved to be a natural, giggling with delight as George led Pepper in a gentle circle around the yard. Miguel was cautious at first, but quickly gained confidence. Elena, after mastering the basics on Pepper, was escorted to the barn where she was introduced to Daisy, a beautiful chestnut mare with a white blaze. James and Maria watched from the porch, marveling at how normal it all felt despite the extraordinary circumstances. Their children learning to ride horses on George Strait's ranch the morning after a dramatic escape from Chuck Peterson at a sold-out concert. He's good with them, Maria observed quietly. Like a grandpa. James nodded. Hard to believe this is the same man whose posters covered half the girls' lockers when we were in high school. As George helped Lucy dismount from her final turn on Pepper, James's phone rang. He didn't recognize the number, but answered anyway. Mr. Rodriguez, this is Rebecca Torres from the San Antonio Express News. The reporter's voice was crisp and professional. I apologize for calling on a Sunday, but after last night's incident, we've decided to accelerate our timeline on the Peterson construction story. James moved away from the porch for privacy. What exactly does that mean? It means we're publishing an investigative piece next Sunday exposing Peterson's practices, safety violations, labor law infractions, fraudulent billing on government contracts. Your evidence has been immensely helpful in corroborating what other sources have told us. Will my name be in the article? James asked, concern evident in his voice. We can keep you anonymous if you prefer, listed only as a former high-level employee, Rebecca assured him. But the impact would be stronger with your on-the-record testimony. James watched his children with George, seeing their carefree joy, and thought about how quickly their security could be threatened if he made the wrong decision. I need to discuss this with my wife, he said finally. And with George. George, Strait, Rebecca sounded surprised. Is he involved in this beyond helping your family? He's become... James paused, searching for the right word. An advocate for us? A friend? Interesting, Rebecca mused. His involvement could significantly raise the profile of this story. Would he be willing to comment? That would be his decision, James replied carefully. But I wouldn't count on it. He's a private person. After ending the call, James rejoined the others. George had dismounted and was showing Miguel how to properly brush Pepper after a ride. Everything okay? Maria asked, noting James's pensive expression. That was the reporter from last night. They're running the Peterson story next Sunday. Maria's eyes widened slightly. So soon? George looked up, his attention caught by their conversation. Peterson's behavior last night probably forced their hand. News travels fast in this town. She wants me to go on record, James explained. Use my name, my testimony. George handed the brush to Miguel, and approached the porch. "That's a big decision, one that shouldn't be made lightly or quickly." "What would you do?" James asked simply. George considered the question, taking off his hat and running a hand through his silver hair. "Can't tell you what to do, James, but I can tell you what I know from experience. Some fights need to be fought in the open, with your name and reputation standing behind your words. Others are better handled from behind the scenes. And this fight, which kind is it? Only you can decide that," George replied. "But I will say this. Peterson showed his true colors last night. A man who'd storm into a public venue, intoxicated, and making threats, is a man who's afraid of what you know." James nodded slowly. "The Business Ethics Council investigator said something similar when I met with her on Friday. She said my documentation was the most comprehensive she'd seen in years." "Dad," Miguel called out, "George says we can ride again tomorrow if we want." James forced a smile for his son. "That's great, mijo." To George, he added in a lower voice, "I need to protect my family. That has to come first." "Absolutely," George agreed immediately. "And just so you know, Judge Garza has arranged for additional security measures here on the ranch, just as a precaution. Nothing obvious, just a couple of his trusted bailiffs taking some paid vacation time in our guest cabins on the north end of the property." The knowledge that such measures were deemed necessary sent a chill through James despite the warm morning sun. "You really think Peterson would try something?" "I think Peterson is desperate," George answered honestly. "His company is already under scrutiny from the State Contractors Board. If this story breaks with evidence of fraud on government contracts, he's looking at potential criminal charges, not just civil penalties." Later that afternoon, after George had returned to the main house and the children were resting from their exciting morning, James and Maria sat at the kitchen table with cups of coffee, discussing their options. "If you use your name, make this public," Maria said. "It could affect your future employment opportunities. Not everyone will appreciate a whistleblower, even when they're doing the right thing." "I know," James acknowledged. "But if I stay anonymous, Peterson can spin it as disgruntled employees making false accusations." "You have documentation," Maria reminded him. "That speaks for itself. Documents can be questioned, dismissed as taken out of context." James stared into his coffee as if seeking answers in its dark surface. A person standing up and saying, "I saw this, I experienced this, here's what happened." That's harder. To dismiss. Maria studied her husband's face, recognizing the determination that was settling into his features. "You've already decided, haven't you?" James met her gaze. "I think I have. But it has to be our decision, together. This affects all of us." "I've been thinking about what you said the other night," Maria replied, "about finding our purpose in all this. Maybe this is it, to shine a light on these wrongs so others don't suffer." "Even if it makes things harder for us?" James asked. Maria reached across the table to take his hand. "We've already faced the worst, mi amor. Lost our home, nearly lost our daughter's health. What could be harder than that?" James squeezed her hand gratefully. "So we're agreed. I tell Rebecca Torres I'll go on record." "Yes," Maria said firmly, "but we asked George for advice on how to prepare for the fallout." Monday morning arrived with a clarity of purpose for James, after seeing the children off to their first day at their new schools. A transition made smoother by George's assistant Denise, who had arranged everything from enrollment paperwork to transportation. He called Rebecca Torres. "I'll do the interview," he told her, "on the record, full name, but I have conditions." "I'm listening," the reporter replied. "No photographs of my children, no mention of where we're currently living, and I want to review any direct quotes attributed to me before publication." "Those are fair terms," Rebecca agreed. "When can we meet?" They arranged to meet that afternoon at the offices of the San Antonio Express News. Before heading into the city, James stopped by the main ranch house to update George on his decision. "You're doing the right thing," George assured him, as they walked along a fence line where several of his prized quarter horses grazed. "But it won't be easy. Once this story breaks, Peterson and his allies will come at you hard." "I know," James said. "That's partly why I wanted to talk to you. I need advice on how to prepare for that." George nodded thoughtfully. "First rule of dealing with public scrutiny: never lose your temper. No matter what they say about you, staying calm and dignified always serves you better in the long run." "That might be difficult if they come after my family," James admitted. "Understandable," George acknowledged. "But remember, losing control plays into their hands." Second rule: don't engage with every accusation. Some attacks aren't worth dignifying with a response. James listened intently as George continued sharing wisdom gleaned from decades in the public eye. Though their situations were vastly different, one a music superstar, the other a construction foreman turned whistleblower, the principles of maintaining integrity under pressure applied equally. As James prepared to leave for his interview, George stopped him with a hand on his shoulder. "One more thing, I had my attorney draw up some papers for you." He handed James a sealed envelope. "It's a formal lease agreement for the guest house, 1-year term, nominal rent of $1, completely legal and binding." James looked at the envelope in confusion. "I don't understand." "It establishes your legal residency here," George explained. "Makes it harder for anyone to claim you're just staying temporarily in an unknown location. Gives you a permanent address for school records, employment, everything." "A year?" James was stunned by the generosity. "George, that's too much." "It's what friends do," George interrupted gently. "Besides, my grandkids have taken a shine to your children. Norma and I enjoy having a family around again. So don't think of it as charity. Think of it as a mutually beneficial arrangement." Overwhelmed, James could only shake the man's hand in gratitude before departing for his interview with Rebecca Torres. The newspaper offices were a whirlwind of activity when James arrived. Rebecca greeted him in the lobby and escorted him to a small conference room where 2 other people waited. A man she introduced as the paper's legal counsel, and a woman identified as the investigative team editor. For the next 3 hours, James walked them through his experiences at Peterson Construction, providing context for the documents he'd shared earlier. He described the gradual descent from occasional corner-cutting to systematic fraud, from casual disregard of safety regulations to deliberate falsification of inspection reports. "The Westlake Senior Center project was when I knew I couldn't look the other way anymore," James explained. "Peterson underbid by nearly 20% to get that municipal contract. When I asked how we could possibly complete the work at that price point while maintaining safety standards, he told me, 'The standards are flexible if you know which inspectors to call.'" Rebecca's fingers flew across her keyboard, documenting every word. "And this was a city-funded project? Taxpayer money?" James nodded grimly. $3 million, and the building that resulted isn't what the city paid for. The foundation is substandard. The electrical work doesn't meet code. They just paid off the inspector to sign off on it. There are seniors in that building right now who could be in danger if there's an electrical fire." The legal counsel looked up sharply. "That's a serious allegation, Mr. Rodriguez. Can you substantiate it?" "I documented everything," James confirmed. "After that project, I started keeping detailed records of every instruction that violated code, every substitution of inferior materials, every inspection that was rushed or falsified." "Why didn't you report it at the time?" the editor asked, her tone not accusatory but curious. James's expression was pained. "I told myself I was gathering evidence, but truthfully, I needed the job. Lucy's medical bills were piling up, and construction jobs for someone my age aren't easy to find. He paused. I'm not proud of that decision. Now, you're coming forward when it counts, Rebecca assured him, and your evidence will help ensure no one else is endangered by these practices. As the interview concluded, the legal counsel provided James with information about whistleblower protections and advised him on what to expect once the story broke. Peterson will almost certainly attempt to discredit you, he warned. He may claim you were fired for incompetence or dishonesty. He might even suggest you fabricated the documentation. James nodded, George's advice echoing in his mind. Stay calm. Don't engage with every accusation. I'm prepared for that, he said with more confidence than he felt. On the drive back to the ranch, James's phone rang. The caller ID showed Santiago Hernandez. James, I just received a very interesting call, Santiago began without preamble. Chuck Peterson offered to subcontract the foundation work for our new Riverwalk development at 15% below market rate. James frowned. That's unusual. Peterson rarely takes subcontracting roles and never at below market rates. Indeed, Santiago agreed. And even more interesting, he specifically mentioned that he'd heard I'd hired you and wanted to warn me about potential quality control issues in your work. James gripped the steering wheel tighter. He's trying to undermine me. Precisely, but he made a tactical error. Santiago's voice took on a note of satisfaction. He doesn't know about my history with George, or that I was already aware of his questionable practices. His attempt to disparage you only confirmed what we suspected about his character. What did you tell him? I thanked him for his concern and said I'd take it under advisement, Santiago replied. Better to let him think he might have planted seeds of doubt. Meanwhile, I've alerted our legal team to preserve the record of this call. It could constitute attempted interference with your employment, another potential legal issue for Mr. Peterson. After ending the call, James sat in his parked car at a roadside rest stop for several minutes, processing everything. The stakes were escalating rapidly. What had begun as a personal injustice, being fired for attending to his daughter's medical needs, had evolved into something far larger, exposing systemic fraud and endangerment that affected public safety. His phone buzzed with a text from George. How did the interview go? James typed back, well, I think Peterson already tried to undermine me with Santiago. George's response came quickly. Not surprised. Remember what we discussed. Stay the course. As James drove the final miles back to the ranch, he reflected on how dramatically his life had changed in just 3 weeks. From homeless and hopeless on a San Antonio street corner to living on George Strait's ranch and preparing to be the central whistleblower in a major news expose. If someone had described this scenario to him a month ago, he would have dismissed it as an impossible fantasy. Yet here he was, driving past the security gate that protected the sprawling ranch toward the guest house that had become their sanctuary. Ahead, he could see Maria and the children in the yard. Lucy was sitting on a wooden swing that George's ranch manager had installed for her, while Elena and Miguel played fetch with one of the ranch dogs. The scene of domestic tranquility stood in stark contrast to the gathering storm he'd just set in motion. As he parked and stepped out of the car, Maria approached him with a curious expression. How did it go? She asked. Well enough, he replied, pulling her into a hug. But it's real now. There's no going back. She leaned back to study his face. Having second thoughts? James glanced at his children, especially at Lucy, whose breathing was stronger and whose smile came more readily with each passing day. In this clean country air. No, he said firmly. No second thoughts. Whatever happens next, we're doing the right thing. Maria nodded, her faith in him unwavering. George called while you were gone. He invited us to dinner at the main house. Tonight, Said there are some people he wants us to meet, people who can help with what's coming. More allies? James asked, a note of wonder in his voice. It seems we've found ourselves in the middle of a powerful network, Maria confirmed. All because one good man stopped to help carry a box. As they walked together toward their children, James felt a strange mixture of apprehension and determination. The next few weeks would bring challenges they couldn't yet imagine. Chuck Peterson would fight back with every resource at his disposal. There would be accusations, possibly threats, certainly stress. But for the first time in his life, James Rodriguez wasn't facing adversity alone. He had his loving family, a secure home, meaningful employment, and allies with the power and will to stand beside him. Most importantly, he had the quiet certainty that comes from choosing principle over expedience, truth over comfort. The confrontation ahead would test them all. But as George had reminded him that morning, some fights need to be fought in the open, with your name and reputation standing behind your words. This was one of those fights, and James was finally ready for it. Dinner at the main house that evening was unlike anything the Rodriguez family had experienced before. The sprawling Spanish-style ranch home was both elegant and welcoming, with high-beamed ceilings, wide hallways adorned with Western art, and furniture that invited comfortable conversation rather than formal stiffness. George's wife, Norma, greeted them at the door with genuine warmth, immediately putting the children at ease. In her mid-60s, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that matched her husband's, her silver-streaked dark hair framing a face that had aged gracefully. "We're so glad you could join us," she told Maria, taking her hands in a gesture of friendship. "George has told me so much about your family." Inside, James was surprised to find not just a small gathering, but what appeared to be a carefully assembled strategic meeting. Judge Garza was there, along with Santiago Hernandez and his wife Carmen. Rebecca Torres sat in conversation with a distinguished man James didn't recognize, but whom George introduced as Thomas Ellison, a senior partner at one of San Antonio's most prestigious law firms. "Thomas has agreed to represent you pro bono in any legal matters arising from the Peterson situation," George explained to James. "He's the best there is." Ellison shook James's hand firmly. "Your courage in coming forward is commendable, Mr. Rodriguez. My firm takes great interest in cases that serve the public good, and yours certainly qualifies." The children were ushered to another part of the house by Norma, who had arranged for George's grandchildren to join them for dinner and entertainment in a separate dining area. "Let the kids be kids," she said with a smile to Maria. "They deserve some normalcy while the adults handle the complex stuff." Once the children were settled, the adults gathered in George's study, a comfortable room lined with bookshelves and memorabilia from his long career. A large oak table had been set up with folders for everyone present. "I hope you don't mind, James," George said, "but I took the liberty of organizing this little strategy session. What you're about to face will require coordination." Judge Garza spoke up. "The story breaks Sunday. By Monday morning, Peterson will likely have his legal team working on some form of counterattack, a defamation suit being the most probable. First move, which would be entirely without merit," Ellison added reassuringly. "Truth is an absolute defense against defamation. Your documentation is impeccable." Santiago spread his hands. "Still, we should anticipate every possible angle of attack, personal, professional, legal." James looked around the table at these influential people who had gathered to help his family, people whose paths he never would have crossed if not for a chance encounter with George Strait on the worst day of his life. "I don't know what to say," he admitted. "Why are you all doing this?" George exchanged glances with the others before answering. "Everyone here has their reasons, James. For me, it's simple. I saw a good man and his family in trouble, and I had the means to help. For others," he gestured to Judge Garza, The judge leaned forward. Mr. Rodriguez, Peterson Construction has been awarded 15 municipal contracts in the last 3 years. If your allegations are correct, and the evidence suggests our public safety has been compromised across our city, my duty extends beyond the courtroom to the community I serve. Rebecca Torres added, and I became a journalist to expose exactly this kind of corruption. The public has a right to know when their tax dollars are being misused and their safety endangered. One by one, each person explained their involvement, revealing a web of interconnected concerns about Peterson's practices. James realized that his personal injustice had simply been the catalyst that brought these larger issues to light. For the next 2 hours, they methodically outlined a strategy for the coming weeks. Ellison explained the legal protections afforded to whistleblowers and the counter-arguments to any potential litigation from Peterson. Rebecca detailed the rollout plan for her investigative series, which would span 3 consecutive Sundays, building a comprehensive case against Peterson Construction's practices. Judge Garza, careful to maintain his judicial impartiality, nonetheless provided insights into the potential legal ramifications for Peterson should criminal charges eventually be filed. The district attorney has been quietly gathering evidence. For months, he revealed. Your documentation may be the tipping point that moves them to action. Throughout the discussion, George remained a steady, calming presence, occasionally offering a perspective that cut through legal complexities to the human core of the matter. James noticed how the others deferred to him not because of his celebrity, but because of his wisdom and integrity. As the meeting concluded and they moved to the dining room for dinner, James found himself beside George at the back of the group. "This is all overwhelming," he confessed quietly. George nodded in understanding. "I know it is, but remember, James, you didn't ask for any of this. You simply stood by your principles when it would have been easier not to. That kind of integrity attracts the right kind of allies." Dinner was a more relaxed affair, with the children rejoining them and conversation turning to lighter topics. Lucy, who had become noticeably stronger in the weeks since moving to the ranch, proudly showed George a drawing she had made of Pepper, the pony she'd ridden. "That's real good, Lucy," George praised, examining the crayon artwork with genuine interest. "You've got a talent there. Miss Norma says I can come help feed the horses tomorrow," Lucy announced happily. "If it's okay with Mom and Dad." Maria smiled at her daughter's enthusiasm. "As long as your breathing is good and you take it easy." James watched this interaction with a fullness in his heart he couldn't quite name. Seeing his daughter, who just weeks ago had been struggling for breath in a smoke-filled apartment, now thriving and excited about helping with horses on George Strait's ranch, seemed almost like a dream. Later that night, as they walked back to the guest house under a canopy of stars, Elena voiced what James had been feeling. "It's weird, isn't it?" she said thoughtfully, "how the worst thing that ever happened to us led to all this." James put his arm around his daughter's shoulders. "Life has a way of surprising us sometimes, Mia." "Do you think we'll have to leave when all this is over?" she asked, the worry evident in her voice. "Go back to an apartment in the city?" James exchanged glances with Maria over the children's heads. "I don't know what the future holds," he answered honestly, "but whatever happens, we'll face it together." The Sunday morning, when Rebecca's first article hit the newsstands and the Express News website dawned clear and bright, James had barely slept. Anxiety over the public exposure, warring with conviction about the righteousness of their cause. He needn't have worried about the article's impact. Rebecca had crafted a meticulously researched exposé that laid out the case against Peterson Construction with damning clarity. James's testimony and documentation formed the backbone of the piece, but she had corroborated every claim with additional sources and evidence. The result was irrefutable and devastating. By mid-morning, James's phone was ringing constantly with calls from former colleagues, other news outlets seeking comment, and even city officials wanting to discuss his experiences with municipal contracts. As George had advised, he directed all media inquiries to Thomas Ellison and focused on keeping his family insulated from the sudden attention. George stopped by the guest house around noon, bringing Sunday lunch for everyone. "Thought you might not feel like going into town today," he explained, as he set down several containers of barbecue from his favorite local joint. "Thank you," James said gratefully. "It's been intense." "Seen the article?" James nodded. "Rebecca did an incredible job. It's comprehensive, fair, and damning," George finished for him. "Peterson's finished in this town if even half of what's in there is proven." "It will be," James assured him. "Every document is authentic. Every claim is verifiable." They were setting the table for lunch when a security alert sounded on George's phone. He checked it quickly, his expression hardening. "Chuck Peterson just pulled up to the main security gate," he informed James. "He's demanding to speak with you." Maria, who had been helping Lucy wash her hands, looked up in alarm. "Here? How did he find us?" "Property records are public," George explained grimly. "The lease agreement we signed would have been filed with the county clerk." James felt the blood drain from his face. "The children are safe," George assured him firmly. "He's not getting past the security gate, but I do need to go deal with this. You all stay here." As George headed for the door, James made a quick decision. "I'm coming with you." "James, that's not necessary," George protested. "Yes, it is," James insisted. "This is my fight. I can't hide behind others forever." After ensuring Maria would keep the children inside and away from windows, James accompanied George to the main security gate, nearly a mile from the house. They traveled in George's truck, driving in tense silence until they crested the hill that overlooked the entrance. 2 security guards stood blocking the gate, their posture professional but unmistakably firm. On the other side, Chuck Peterson paced beside his luxury SUV, his face flushed with anger even at this distance. When he spotted George's approaching truck, he jabbed a finger toward it accusingly. George parked a safe distance from the gate and stepped out, James following. As they approached, Peterson's rage seemed to intensify. "You think you can destroy me with lies?" he shouted at James. 25 years building my company, and you and your country music friend think you can tear it down with some newspaper. Hit piece?" George stepped slightly in front of James, his voice calm but authoritative. "Mr. Peterson, you're trespassing on private property. I'm going to have to ask you to leave." "Stay out of this, Strait," Peterson snarled. "This is between me and my former employee." "Former employee whom you fired illegally," James spoke up steadily. "Everything in that article is true, Chuck. Every document authentic, every violation real." Peterson's face contorted. "You signed non-disclosure agreements. Those documents were company property. NDAs don't cover illegal activity," James replied, remembering what Thomas Ellison had explained during their strategy session. "And whistleblower laws protect my right to report safety violations and fraud." "You ungrateful—" Peterson caught himself visibly struggling for control. "I gave you opportunities when no one else would. Made you a foreman when you barely had a high school education. I earned that position," James countered calmly. "With 22 years of honest work, what I never earned was being fired for taking care of my sick daughter." Peterson shifted tactics, his voice suddenly wheedling. "Look, James, we can fix this. Whatever they're paying you for this hit job, I can double it, triple it." James stared at him in disbelief. "No one's paying me anything. This isn't about money." "Everything's about money," Peterson insisted. "Just tell me what you want. We can make this go away." George, who had been silently observing, finally spoke. "He already told you what he wants, Peterson. Accountability, justice, things you can't buy your way out of." Peterson glared at George. "You stay out of this. Using your celebrity to attack a legitimate businessman. I'll sue you for interfering with my company." George remained unruffled. "You're welcome to try. My attorneys would be fascinated by that case." He nodded to the security guards. "Please escort Mr. Peterson off my property. If he resists, call the sheriff." As the guards moved toward him, Peterson took a step back. "This isn't over, Rodriguez. Not by a long shot." "Yes, it is," James replied with quiet certainty. "The truth is out now. Whatever happens next, you can't bury it again." They watched as Peterson returned to his vehicle and sped away, gravel spraying from his tires. "You handled that well," George commented as they walked back to his truck. "Kept your cool, stuck to the facts." "I was terrified," James admitted, "but also relieved somehow. Facing him directly, seeing how desperate he is, it confirmed that we're doing the right thing." When they returned to the guest house, Maria rushed to James, fear and relief warring in her expression. "What happened? Are you okay?" "I'm fine," James assured her. "Peterson's gone, and I don't think he'll be back." George checked his phone, which had been buzzing during their drive back. Judge Garza texted, "The district attorney's office just announced they're opening a formal investigation into Peterson Construction's government contracts, and the State Contractors Board is holding an emergency meeting tomorrow to review his license." The swiftness of the official response surprised them all. The wheels of justice, so often frustratingly slow, seemed to be turning with unusual efficiency in this case. "That's because of the public safety implications," George explained when James commented on it. "Those senior housing projects, the elementary school renovation Peterson's company did last year, people are worried about their structural integrity now." The rest of Sunday passed in a strange combination of tension and relief. James and Maria kept the children occupied with board games and movies, trying to maintain normalcy despite the extraordinary circumstances. Monday brought a new wave of developments. Thomas Ellison called early to report that Peterson had indeed filed a defamation lawsuit, not just against James, but against the newspaper, Rebecca Torres personally, and George Strait for conspiracy to damage Peterson's business interests. "It's a desperate move," Ellison assured them. "Legally frivolous and transparently retaliatory. We'll file for dismissal immediately." By midweek, the story had expanded beyond San Antonio to state and even national news outlets. James received a call from a producer at 60 Minutes interested in featuring the case in a segment on construction fraud and public safety. More former Peterson employees came forward with corroborating accounts, strengthening the case against the company. Through it all, George remained a steady support, neither seeking the spotlight nor shying away from his role in helping the Rodriguez family. When reporters asked about his involvement, he simply stated, "I believe in standing up for what's right and helping neighbors in need. That's how I was raised in Texas." 10 days after the first article was published, James received a call from Santiago Hernandez. "Turn on Channel 4, Santiago instructed without preamble. "Right now." James grabbed the remote and switched on the television to find Chuck Peterson being led in handcuffs from his office building by FBI agents. The news crawler at the bottom of the screen announced, "Construction magnate Charles Peterson arrested on federal charges of fraud, bribery, and safety violations." "Federal charges?" James asked in disbelief when George called moments later. "The municipal contracts had federal funding components," George explained. "Once the FBI started looking into those money trails, they found much more than anyone expected." That evening, as the family gathered on the porch of the guest house watching the sunset, James felt a curious mixture of vindication and sadness. A man's downfall, even a man as corrupt as Chuck Peterson, was never something to celebrate. Yet the knowledge that his courage in speaking out had potentially protected countless people from dangerous building practices gave him a profound sense of purpose. "What happens now?" Maria asked softly, sensing his contemplative mood. "Now, we build a new life," James replied, putting his arm around her shoulders. "One day at a time." George had invited them to stay in the guest house for the full year, as originally offered, regardless of how quickly the Peterson situation resolved. "No rush to figure out your next steps," he'd assured them. "Sometimes the best decisions come when you have the space and time to make them thoughtfully." For the Rodriguez children, the ranch had become home with remarkable speed. Lucy's health continued to improve dramatically in the clean country air. Elena had discovered a passion for horses and spent every available moment at the stables, where George's head wrangler had taken her under his wing. Miguel, initially the most reluctant to adapt to country living, had formed an unlikely friendship with George's grandson, bonding over fishing at the ranch's stock pond. As for James and Maria, they found themselves contemplating possibilities they never would have imagined before. Santiago had promoted James to project director after his exemplary handling of his first assignment, with a salary that allowed Maria to pursue her long-deferred dream of completing her nursing degree. "I've been thinking," James said as they watched the Texas sky transform into a canvas of orange and purple hues. "When our time here is up, maybe we shouldn't go back to the city." Maria looked at him questioningly. "What are you suggesting?" "There's a small property for sale about 10 miles from here. 5 acres, modest house that needs some work." He paused. "I could fix it up, make it ours." "Could we afford it?" Maria asked practically, though her eyes revealed her interest. "With my new salary and the settlement Ellison thinks we'll get from the wrongful termination suit, yes." James squeezed her hand. "The children are thriving here. Lucy's health is better than it's ever been, and I'm only 30 minutes from the office." Maria leaned against him contentedly. "From homeless to homeowners in less than a year. It's hard to believe, all because a stranger stopped to help carry a box," James marveled. From across the property came the soft notes of a guitar. George often played on his own porch in the evenings, the music drifting through the Texas twilight like a gentle reminder of how one person's kindness could change everything. James thought back to that desperate day on the street corner, how close they had come to giving up hope. He remembered his father's words about losing your way to find your purpose, and for the first time he truly understood their meaning. The fire had taken their possessions, but given them something far more valuable. A new beginning, unexpected friendships, and the knowledge that even in their darkest hour, they hadn't been alone. George Strait hadn't just helped them carry their boxes. He had helped them rebuild their lives. And that, James realized, was a story worth telling for generations to come. The September morning dawned bright and clear, with just a hint of autumn crispness in the Texas air. James Rodriguez stood on the front porch of his new home, coffee mug in hand, watching the sun rise over the 5 acres of land that now belonged to his family. The modest ranch house behind him had been transformed over the past 6 months. New roof, fresh paint, renovated kitchen, and a special room for Lucy with state-of-the-art air filtration systems. "Dad, have you seen my boots?" Miguel's voice called from inside. "The good ones?" "Check by the back door," James replied, smiling to himself. At 11 years old, his son had embraced country living with unexpected enthusiasm, especially after George had gifted him a pair of custom-made cowboy boots for his birthday 3 months ago. Today was a special day for the Rodriguez family, the 1-year anniversary of the fire that had destroyed their apartment and set in motion the extraordinary chain of events that followed. Rather than mourn the loss, they had decided to celebrate their rebirth with a gathering of the people who had helped them along the way. Maria appeared beside him, slipping her arm around his waist. Nervous about today? A little, James admitted. It's still hard to believe we're hosting George Strait and his friends at our home. Our home, Maria repeated, savoring the words. Sometimes I still expect to wake up and find this has all been a dream. James pressed a kiss to her temple. If it is, I don't want to wake up. The past year had brought changes none of them could have anticipated. Following Peterson's arrest, the investigation into his company's practices had expanded dramatically, revealing a web of corruption that extended to city inspectors, permit officials, and even a junior member of the city council. The ensuing scandal had led to sweeping reforms in San Antonio's construction oversight processes, with James being invited to serve on a citizens' advisory board helping to reshape the regulations. Peterson himself now awaited trial on 27 federal counts, his company dissolved, his assets frozen. The civil suit for James's wrongful termination had been settled out of court for an amount substantial enough to secure the family's financial future and fund Maria's nursing education. But the legal vindication paled in comparison to the personal growth the family had experienced. Lucy, now 7, had gone nearly 6 months without a serious asthma attack, her health strengthening. In their rural environment, Elena, 15, had discovered a passion for equestrian activities that had transformed her from a self-conscious teenager into a confident young woman who had recently won her first junior barrel racing competition. James himself had flourished at Hernandez Development, where his commitment to quality and safety had earned him a reputation as one of the most respected project directors in the region. Santiago had recently promoted him again, this time to Vice President of Operations, with oversight of all the company's construction projects throughout South Texas. Their new property sat exactly 7 miles from George's ranch, close enough for the families to remain connected, but allowing the Rodriguez family the independence and self-sufficiency that was so important to James's sense of dignity. Elena's already at the stables with Norma, Maria reported, checking her watch. She wanted to make sure Daisy was properly groomed before everyone arrives. George had sold Elena the gentle mare she'd learned to ride on, keeping the horse boarded at his ranch where the teenager could visit daily. The arrangement had given their daughter not just a beloved pet, but a sense of responsibility and achievement that had transformed her. The sound of a vehicle coming up their gravel driveway pulled James from his reflections. "That'll be Santiago and Carmen," he said, recognizing the familiar SUV. Over the next hour, guests arrived steadily. Judge Garza and his wife, Thomas Ellison, Rebecca Torres, now with a Pulitzer Prize nomination for her investigative series, and several of James's colleagues from Hernandez Development. Each arrival brought food, drinks, or gifts for the house, in the tradition of a proper Texas housewarming. George and Norma were the last to arrive, pulling up in George's pickup truck rather than anything flashy, characteristic of the man's unassuming nature despite his fame. "Place looks great, James," George approved, surveying the renovated house and carefully landscaped yard as he stepped out of the vehicle. "You've done wonders with it." "Had good help," James replied, shaking his hand warmly. "Miguel's becoming quite the carpenter." Following in his father's footsteps, George observed with a smile. He carried a large wrapped package under his arm, which he handed to James. "Just a little something for the new home." Inside, the gathering had the relaxed feeling of a family reunion rather than a formal party. Children played in the spacious backyard, while adults congregated on the expanded deck James had built himself. Conversation flowed easily among people who had been strangers a year ago, but were now bound by shared purpose and experience. After lunch, when everyone had eaten their fill of the traditional Mexican dishes Maria had prepared alongside Texas barbecue, George quietly asked James and Maria to join him and Norma for a moment of privacy. They retreated to the family's living room, where George finally encouraged them to open his gift. Carefully removing the wrapping paper, James revealed a beautifully framed custom artwork, a hand-lettered rendering of lyrics from one of George's lesser-known songs. "You'll be there." The chorus stood out in elegant script. "It's the life that you lead and the people you touch. If that all comes together, then it can't be too much. And the way that you shine, it just can't help but show. You'll be there, my friend, when forever rolls." Around, beneath the framed lyrics, was a photo montage. Images captured over the past year showing the Rodriguez family's journey from the day of the fire to the present. There were pictures of Lucy riding Pepper, Elena winning her barrel racing trophy, Miguel fishing with George's grandson, Maria in her nursing school uniform, James at his promotion ceremony, and at the center, a candid shot of the entire Rodriguez family with George and Norma at the ranch, everyone smiling genuinely in a moment of perfect happiness. "Norma put this together," George explained softly. "Thought you might want a reminder of how far you've come." Maria wiped tears from her eyes. "It's beautiful. Thank you both." "The song lyrics," James began, emotion making it difficult to continue. "Seemed fitting," George said simply. "What happened with your family this past year? It reminds me why I wrote those words. Life isn't about what you have. It's about the connections you make, the lives you touch." Norma, usually content to remain in the background, spoke up. "You know, when George first told me about meeting your family that day, he said something I'll never forget. He said, 'I think God put me on that street corner for a reason.'" Maria nodded through her tears. "I believe that too. It wasn't coincidence. But here's what I want you both to understand," George continued earnestly. "What happened afterward, that wasn't me. That was you. Your courage, James, in standing up against Peterson. Your strength, Maria, in holding your family together through the hardest times. Your children's resilience. I may have offered a hand when you needed it, but you're the ones who rebuilt your lives." James shook his head modestly. "We couldn't have done it without you." "Maybe, maybe not, George." "Acknowledged. But the point is, you did it. And in the process, you helped change things in San Antonio for the better because of your willingness to speak out. Buildings are safer, corrupt officials have been removed, and Peterson can't hurt anyone else. I never thought of myself as someone who could make that kind of difference," James admitted. "Most heroes don't," George replied with a knowing smile. "They just do what's right when it counts." A commotion from outside drew their attention, happy shouts and applause. Looking through the window, they saw that Elena had arrived on horseback, demonstrating her riding skills for the gathered guests. "We should rejoin the party," Maria suggested, carefully setting the framed gift on their mantelpiece. As they moved toward the door, George placed a hand on James's shoulder. "One more thing. That advisory committee you're on for the city's construction reforms, the governor's office called me yesterday. They're looking to establish a statewide task force on construction safety and accountability, and your name came up as a potential chairman." James stared at him in disbelief. "Me? But I'm not a politician or a regulator." "Exactly," George nodded approvingly. "You're better. You're someone who's been in the trenches, who knows the industry from the ground up, and who's proven he'll stand for what's right regardless of personal cost. Those qualities are rare, James." "I don't know what to say," James replied honestly. "Say you'll think about it," George suggested. "Talk it over with Maria. Pray on it. The position would be part-time to start, allowing you to keep your job. With Santiago." Before James could respond further, the back door burst open and Miguel ran in, his face flushed with excitement. "Dad! Mr. Hernandez brought his new quarter horse, and he said I could ride it if you say it's okay." "We'll be right there, mijo," James assured him with a smile. As they rejoined the gathering, James found himself observing the scene as if from a distance, his beautiful, healthy children, his wife engaged in animated conversation with Carmen Hernandez about her nursing courses, their new friends and allies, enjoying the home they had created. Judge Garza approached, a glass of iced tea in hand. "Remarkable what can happen in a year, isn't it?" "Beyond anything I could have imagined," James agreed. "You know," the judge continued thoughtfully, "I've been on the bench for 27 years, seen a lot of cases, a lot of injustices, a lot of legal victories that felt hollow somehow." He nodded toward the gathering. "But this, seeing a family rise from tragedy, watching a community come together to support what's right, this is justice in its truest form." As the afternoon wore on, the celebration took on the quality of a traditional Texas gathering, with impromptu music when George brought out his guitar and was joined by Santiago on harmonica. Children played tag across the yard, dogs barked joyfully, and conversations flowed as freely as the laughter. When the sun began to set, casting long golden shadows across their property, the guests gathered on the expansive back porch for a group photo. James found himself standing beside George as Thomas Ellison set up the camera on a tripod. "Did you ever imagine on that day we met that we'd end up here?" James asked quietly. George considered the question seriously before answering. "I knew I wanted to help your family. Couldn't have predicted exactly how it would unfold." He smiled. "Life's like that. You can't control the whole journey, just the steps you choose to take. One right choice leads to another." James nodded. "Exactly. You choose kindness, it multiplies. You choose courage, it inspires others." George gestured around them. "All this came from a series of right choices by a lot of different people, starting with your decision to keep fighting for your family even when it seemed hopeless." The camera timer beeped and everyone posed, smiling broadly as the shutter clicked. 3 times they repeated the process, ensuring they had captured the perfect memento of the day. As guests began departing as evening fell, the children helped clean up while the adults shared final conversations on the porch. George and Norma were the last to leave, lingering as the stars began to appear in the Texas sky. "You've built something special here," George told James and Maria as they walked him to his truck. "Not just the house, the life, the community." "We learned from the best," Maria replied warmly, embracing Norma. "Will you come to the ranch next weekend?" Norma asked. "Our grandchildren are asking when Lucy and Miguel can come fishing again." Arrangements made and final goodbyes exchanged, James and Maria stood arm in arm, watching the taillights of George's truck disappear down their driveway. The property was quiet now, except for the chorus of cicadas and the distant hooting of an owl. "A year ago tonight," Maria mused, leaning her head against her husband's shoulder, "we were sleeping on cots at the emergency shelter, wondering if we'd ever have a home again." "And now look at us," James replied, gazing back at their house, where the children were visible through the windows, Elena teaching Lucy a dance move in the living room, while Miguel sprawled on the couch with a book. "Do you think we'd appreciate all this as much if we hadn't lost everything first?" Maria wondered. James considered her question carefully. "Maybe not. There's something about standing on the edge of the abyss that makes you value solid ground afterward." They walked back to their home, hand in hand, pausing to look up at the vast canopy of stars visible away from the city lights. "You know what still amazes me?" James said softly. "Of all the street corners in San Antonio, George Strait happened to be driving past ours at exactly the moment we needed help most." Maria squeezed his hand. "I don't think that was an accident, mi amor." "Neither do I," James agreed, "and neither does he." As they stepped onto the porch of the home they had built from their second chance, James reflected on the extraordinary journey of the past year. From the depths of despair on that hot Texas afternoon, with their possessions in boxes on the sidewalk. To this moment of profound contentment and purpose, the path had been neither straight nor easy, but it had led them exactly where they needed to be. Inside, their children waited, healthy, happy, and secure in the knowledge that they were loved not just by their parents, but by an extended family they had found in the most unexpected circumstances. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, including the governor's task force position James was increasingly inclined to accept. But whatever the future held, the Rodriguez family would face it together, stronger for having weathered the storm. And somewhere not too far away, a country music legend who had followed his conscience and stopped to help a stranger would sleep soundly, knowing that sometimes the greatest songs aren't the ones recorded in studios or played on stages, but the ones written through simple acts of kindness that change lives forever. In the quiet night, under the endless Texas sky, both families rested easy in the knowledge that they had found in each other something rare and precious. A friendship forged in adversity and tempered by shared purpose. A connection that would endure long after the echoes of applause had faded and the spotlight had dimmed. For George Strait, whose career had brought him fame and fortune beyond measure, perhaps the most meaningful legacy would be this: that when faced with a family in desperate need, he had not simply passed by. He had stopped, extended his hand, and in doing so, had reminded everyone touched by the story that the true measure of wealth lies not in what we accumulate, but in what we give away. And for the Rodriguez family, the lesson was equally profound, that even in our darkest moments, when all seems lost and hope feels like a luxury we can no longer afford, help can come from the most unexpected sources. That a single act of kindness can be the first domino in a chain of events that transforms not just one family's trajectory, but an entire community's understanding of justice, accountability, and the power of standing together for what is right. As James closed their front door on that perfect Texas evening, 1 year from the day that had nearly broken them, he felt a sense of completion. The circle that had begun with loss had ended with abundance. The journey that had started with a stranger's help had culminated in lasting friendships, and the story that had commenced in desperation had concluded in triumph, not just of circumstance, but of the human spirit. In the end, it wasn't about boxes carried or homes rebuilt, or even justice served. It was about the connections formed when people choose compassion over indifference, courage over comfort, and integrity over expedience. Those choices, more than any material possession or professional achievement, constituted the true wealth they had gained, a wealth that could never be lost to fire or flood or any other calamity life might bring. As James Rodriguez drifted to sleep that night beside his wife, in their own home on their own land, under the vast Texas sky, his final thought was one of profound gratitude, not just for what they had received, but for what they had become, and for the extraordinary journey that had transformed them all.